Mark Reynolds had always considered himself a competent human being, which was mostly true if one ignored the minor detail that he had just sent a deeply sarcastic message intended for his supervisor to the Queen of the Athari Dominion. The message, a half-hearted complaint about station maintenance and a tongue-in-cheek commentary on the supposed inefficiency of alien bureaucracy, had somehow zipped across the quantum comm networks and ended up in the inbox of someone who could, theoretically, vaporize him with a single thought. He had seconds to panic, but what emerged from his mouth was not panic. It was a choked laugh because, really, if he didn't laugh now, he would probably cry. 10 minutes later, his apartment's door emitted a soft, melodic hum. Mark froze, coffee in hand, the dark roast sloshing dangerously close to the edge of his mug. The door handle turned itself slowly, with a grace that only advanced Athari tech could manage, and then the door opened. She was there. Not an envoy, not a hologram, but the Queen herself. She looked almost human, except for her ears, long, elegant, and tapered like the leaves of some plant Mark couldn't name. Her hair was silvered, catching the light in an unnatural shimmer, and her eyes were a shade of violet he had no words for, eyes that made him feel simultaneously judged and welcomed. "Hello," she said, and her voice was calm with just a trace of amusement, like someone who had seen too many incompetent humans flail about and decided it was worth enjoying. Mark's brain stalled. His hands, which had been holding coffee for mere seconds, now trembled in indecision. He gestured vaguely toward the couch. Tea, coffee, something stronger?" His voice cracked halfway through the question as if it were embarrassed to speak to royalty. The Queen's lips twitched. "You make coffee?" she asked, though her tone suggested she was aware it was probably terrible because she could hear the precise chemical composition of every brew on the station. She stepped in, and the subtle hum of her personal field displaced a little of the air around him. Mark almost tripped over his own feet trying to step aside, and in doing so, he spilled a drop of coffee on the floor. "Oh, excellent," he said, attempting humor, first impression, caffeinated disaster. The Queen raised an eyebrow and made a small, amused sound that could almost be a laugh. "I read your message," she said, settling lightly onto his couch in a way that somehow didn't crush it, as if she had memorized human physics in some obscure branch of alien calculus. "You find human bureaucracy amusing." There was no accusation in her tone, only the sharp edge of curiosity. Mark swallowed and nodded vigorously. "Yes, very, especially when it involves recalibrating flux conduits for the third time this week. I mean, seriously, who thought it was a good idea to mix nanorepair bots with a gravity flux system?" He waved vaguely at the walls around him, as if they would nod in agreement. The Queen tilted her head, her long ears twitching slightly. "Flux conduits, nanorepair bots, you are not exaggerating?" Mark shook his head, and for some reason he couldn't stop himself from adding, "Well, I exaggerate sometimes, but not about that. That is exactly as chaotic as it sounds." She let out a small chuckle, a sound that reminded him vaguely of wind chimes in zero gravity. It was utterly disarming. A drone whirred past, hovering lazily near the ceiling, its sensors scanning both of them with what seemed like detached interest. "That is an assistant," Mark said nervously. "It doesn't usually follow royalty around, but you know, maintenance schedules." The Queen's eyes flicked toward the drone. "Interesting, it judges your panicked energy well." Mark muttered something about how he had been judged his entire life for that. The Queen didn't respond, only let her smile linger a second longer, like she was testing how far human humility could stretch. Time slipped oddly in that room. Mark, whose sense of hours and minutes usually depended on coffee refills and blinking fluorescence, suddenly found himself narrating a short, impromptu tour of his apartment, mostly to fill the silence and not appear useless. He showed her the small bookshelf filled with dusty human novels, the pile of cables that never seemed to untangle, and his half-completed quantum repair toolkit. Each explanation was punctuated by awkward gestures and occasional jokes. "And here we have a particularly aggressive router that has refused all mediation attempts." The Queen observed all this with a patience that felt like the calm eye of a storm, her ears occasionally flicking in ways that suggested amusement or perhaps an alien form of disbelief. She leaned back, long ears brushing against the couch cushions, and said, "You are remarkably human, Mark Reynolds. Recklessly honest, oddly creative, and catastrophically clumsy." He swallowed, unsure if that was a compliment or a diplomatic warning. I prefer endearingly human, actually, he said, because if he was going to speak, he might as well charm her with humor. She laughed then, a clear, soft sound that seemed to fill the small apartment, and Mark felt a surge of relief. Conversation meandered into strange territories, intergalactic politics, the peculiarities of Authari etiquette, and whether a human could truly survive a week on their food synthesis technology without crying. Mark joked, I once tried one of your nutrient cubes for breakfast. I think it stared back at me. She raised a single elegant eyebrow. Perhaps it did. We often encode consciousness fragments in our cuisine. Subtle but instructive. He laughed, imagining his breakfast staring judgmentally at him. Hours or maybe minutes, time was unpredictable around someone like her, passed as they traded jokes and stories, tension slowly melting into curiosity and amusement. For the first time in his life, Mark wasn't just a human engineer on a dull station orbiting a gas giant. He was the accidental correspondent of an alien queen, a situation that could have been catastrophic but through a mix of luck and wit had become entertaining. By the end of the evening, he realized that his thumb's error had opened a doorway into a world that was terrifying, thrilling, and ridiculously funny all at once, and somehow he couldn't wait to see what would happen next. Mark couldn't remember the last time he had felt so out of place. He had left the modest familiarity of his orbital apartment behind, walking beside the Authari Queen through the docking bay of the Dominion's flagship. The ship itself seemed alive, a colossal entity with surfaces that shimmered faintly as though breathing. Panels shifted subtly underfoot, reflecting not just light but moods, though he suspected the Queen could sense the ship's temperament far better than he ever could. She glided forward with an effortless grace, long ears twitching in rhythm with the ambient hum of the vessel, while he stumbled after her, muttering under his breath about gravity fields and how none of the training manuals had ever prepared him for floating corridors that curve like ribbons in space. You seem concerned, she said without looking back, her violet eyes glinting with amusement. I'm concerned for the floor, Mark replied, kicking lightly at an invisible threshold. It keeps moving. I might trip again, and he paused, realizing she had tilted her head, giving him a look that was equal parts judgment and intrigue. He sighed. Launch myself into the nebula or something. The Queen let out a quiet, chime-like laugh, and Mark, to his horror, felt it warm the tight knot in his chest. They reached a chamber lined with softly glowing walls, shelves filled with floating orbs of light, and screens that displayed systems he didn't recognize. The Queen gestured for him to sit, which was a challenge in itself because the seats hovered slightly above the floor and adjusted automatically to body weight, or so he assumed. Mark lowered himself cautiously, grunting when he hit the correct height with only a slight bounce. She settled opposite him, ears brushing the ambient glow, eyes scanning him as if evaluating whether he could survive more than 5 minutes in this environment without causing an interstellar incident. So, Mark Reynolds, she began, her tone deliberately formal, you have experienced your first proper Authari environment. She paused and one long ear twitched. And you are still alive, remarkable. Thrilling, Mark said dryly, trying for humor while hoping it landed. Also, I like the lighting, very moody, makes me look heroic, don't you think? She didn't answer immediately, only raised an eyebrow, one ear flicking impatiently. Maybe, or like a very confused goat in a neon barn, he added, earning a faint chuckle from her. The Queen was enjoying this far too much, and Mark suspected she had no intention of stopping. As they moved through the ship, she introduced him to various systems, each more bewildering than the last. He tried not to gawk at corridors that folded over themselves, or the gardens where bioluminescent plants hummed with energy. Do they sing? He asked at one point, ducking under a twisting vine. Occasionally, she said, mostly complaints about watering schedules. Mark laughed. I get that, even my ferns at home complain if I forget them for a week. The Queen's ears twitched in amusement, and she shook her head at him as they passed a hovering platform that dispensed some form of nutrition paste, which he immediately labeled interstellar peanut butter. Humans have a curious relationship with food, she said. Why is it important to taste it when nourishment can be encoded? Because if it tastes bad, you get angry, Mark said seriously, testing a blob with his tongue. He made a face and gave a thumbs up anyway. It's character building. She raised an eyebrow. I see you enjoy frustration. He shrugged. Sometimes build stories makes for good anecdotes later, like this one. Hours, or perhaps the span of a galactic rotation, passed as she guided him from lab to control deck, from holographic archives to lounges that seemed to rearrange themselves according to your mood. The queen never lost her composure, though her ears occasionally flicked as if she were quietly entertained by Mark's continuous fumbling attempts at proper etiquette. At one point, he knocked over a delicate orb of light which spun midair, attempting to return to its stand like a stubborn pet. I swear it wasn't sentient, he protested, while the queen smirked and muttered something in Authari that he couldn't parse but guessed was the equivalent of humans and objects always at war. They stopped on a balcony overlooking the planet below, a gas giant that glowed with shifting bands of green and gold. Mark, still recovering from the near collision with a gravity-altering doorway, gestured toward it. Wow, just wow. You guys really live in style. The queen leaned lightly against the railing, ears twitching against the soft energy hum that surrounded them. Style is functional, it maintains morale, also it amuses visitors. She glanced at him. You seem entertained despite everything. Mostly terrified, he admitted. But yes, entertained, you're very good at this intimidation with charm thing. She laughed softly, the sound threading through the balcony, blending with the low rumble of the gas giant's storms. It is a skill we cultivate carefully, she said, though you make it difficult to remain intimidating. The day or night, though time felt irrelevant, stretched onward as they engaged in the queen's form of diplomacy. An exchange of observation and subtle tests, each threaded with humor. Mark found himself laughing at the absurdity of floating utensils, the delicate balance of hovering furniture, and the queen's sharp commentary on human behavior. Yet beneath the levity he sensed intelligence and patience, and something warmer, more personal that went beyond curiosity. Dinner was another trial of improvisation. A table hovered in front of them, filled with synthesized meals that glowed faintly and shifted texture depending on who touched them. Do not be alarmed if it seems to move, she warned. It is merely adaptive. Some humans find it unsettling. Mark poked at a glowing cube with a fork only to have it bounce lightly into his spoon. This is challenging, he said, managing a grin. The queen tilted her head, letting one ear brush her shoulder. Challenging seems to be your specialty, she said. He laughed, realizing that yes, between gravity fields, hovering utensils, and intergalactic etiquette, he was in constant challenge mode. By the end of their first full day aboard the flagship, Mark had tripped over enough invisible thresholds to earn a permanent scowl from a passing maintenance drone and spilled something resembling soup 3 times. And yet he had never laughed so much in his life, nor felt so curiously alive. The queen, for her part, seemed to enjoy the combination of his chaotic charm and blunt human perspective, and she did not appear to regret her impulsive decision to visit him or to bring him aboard her ship. As they settled for the evening, the corridors glowing softly around them and the distant storms of the gas giant casting muted light, Mark realized the accidental message that had thrown him into this surreal situation had opened a doorway into a world he could neither predict nor control. And yet, for the first time, he didn't want to control it. He wanted to stumble, fumble, and laugh his way through whatever this alien adventure had in store, especially with the queen, her long ears flicking in amusement beside him. The adventure, it seemed, had only just begun. The alarm sounded before either of them had a chance to sip their morning synth coffee properly. Mark jerked upright, sending a small cascade of luminescent fluid from the cup onto the floor, where it hovered for a moment before obediently returning to its container. The queen, sitting cross-legged on a floating chair with her ears flicking impatiently, didn't even flinch. It appears your human reflexes are needed, she said, her voice calm but firm. Pirates, local scavenger fleet. Targeting the station. Mark swallowed audibly, feeling a surge of adrenaline and panic in equal measure. Pirates here, really? I thought this place was boring. The queen raised a single elegant eyebrow, long ears twitching. Boring is subjective, Mark Reynolds. Survival, however, is mandatory. They moved swiftly through the corridors, Mark stumbling over his own feet while she floated past effortlessly, ears brushing against shifting walls that reacted to her presence. Holographic displays flickered to life around them, showing the incoming vessels, jagged, improvised ships that looked more like patched-together debris than military craft. "Okay," Mark said, gripping the nearest console. "This is officially worse than trying to rewire a flux conduit while your coffee machine is possessed." He winced at his own joke, but the Queen tilted her head, one ear twitching, and for a brief moment he thought he saw a smile. "Your humor is resilient," she said. "Use it wisely." Mark gave a short, nervous laugh. "Will do. Also, I promise not to trip into any weapons controls this time." They boarded a small anti-gravity shuttle, its panels glowing faintly as if alive, responsive to both thought and motion. Mark took the co-pilot seat, fumbling with controls that made sense only to someone who had half the nerve of a trained pilot and twice the luck. The Queen sat beside him, hands resting lightly on a console, her long ears tracing subtle arcs in the air as she monitored the incoming threat. "Humans improvise in interesting ways," she observed. "Even chaos has a pattern to you." Mark bit back a quip about his chaos being more like organized disasters, focusing instead on piloting the shuttle with all the competence he could muster. The pirate ships approached, jagged and unpredictable, and Mark's mind raced through every scenario he had ever imagined in poorly written space operas. He nudged the controls, sending the shuttle into a carefully calculated loop that brought them behind one of the largest pirate craft. Hope they don't mind a surprise," he muttered. The Queen glanced at him, violet eyes narrowing with amusement. "They will be most displeased," she said. Weapons deployed with precision he didn't think possible, targeting drones spinning into formation around the pirate ships. Mark managed to duck a stray plasma burst, muttering, "Really should have done more yoga before this adventure." The Queen's soft laughter echoed in the cockpit, blending with the hum of the engines. Somehow that laughter steadied him, gave him confidence that his human unpredictability could be an asset rather than a liability. Hours, or perhaps moments, time felt strange in combat, passed in a blur of strategic dodges, improvised maneuvers, and bursts of laser fire that illuminated the void in brief, violent flashes. The pirates' ships faltered under the coordinated counterattack, and one by one they retreated, leaving the station intact. Mark exhaled audibly, wiping his sweaty hands on his uniform. "Well," he said, "that was a fun Tuesday." The Queen's eyes softened slightly. "Your sense of humor does not diminish under pressure. That is rare, Mark Reynolds, rare indeed." Back aboard the flagship, Mark found himself unusually exhausted, yet invigorated. He had survived something that could have destroyed him, not because of sheer skill alone, but because he had learned to trust instinct, wit, and unexpectedly his own courage. The Queen walked beside him in the quiet corridors, ears flicking in the subtle rhythm of satisfaction. "You have changed," she said almost casually, yet Mark caught the gravity behind her tone. "Chaos and humor were your shields. Now they are also your tools." Mark blinked at her, feeling both embarrassed and proud. "So I'm officially useful?" he asked. She let a smile play across her lips. "Useful and more than I anticipated. You adapt, you survive. And you entertain." He laughed, relief and pride mingling. "Entertaining is a talent I've been honing for years." She chuckled, and in the soft glow of the corridors, the tension that had hung between them since the accidental message seemed to melt away. The station below, once a dull, orbiting research facility, now felt like a monument to survival and laughter, a place that had tested them both and forced them to work together in ways neither had imagined. Mark realized that the fear he had felt when sending that first message had transformed into something completely different. A curious confidence, a sense that he could face unexpected events with humor, creativity, and even bravery. The Queen had not only seen him at his most chaotic but had encouraged him to thrive in it. They reached a balcony overlooking the gas giant, its swirling bands of color calming after the chaos. Mark leaned against the railing, catching his breath while the Queen stood beside him, ears brushing the ambient light. "So," he said, finally allowing himself a small, tentative smile, "after all that, what now? Do I get an award for surviving my first interstellar crisis?" She laughed softly, a melodic sound that seemed to harmonize with the distant storms. "Awards are unnecessary. You have earned something far more valuable. Understanding, experience, and companionship." Mark's grin widened, and for the first time he felt the weight of the accidental message as something entirely positive. Companionship, huh? That sounds suspiciously like a promotion. She raised an eyebrow, ears flicking once in amusement. Perhaps it is, in ways both political and personal. He shook his head in disbelief, thinking of the ridiculous path that had brought him here. A me-sent message, a royal visit, floating corridors, synthetic meals that jumped away from him, pirate attacks and laughter that had guided him through it all. And yet, standing there beside her, he felt a clarity he had never known. He was no longer just Mark Reynolds, the bumbling human engineer. He was Mark Reynolds, the accidental confidant of an alien queen, someone capable of wit, courage, and resilience beyond what he had imagined. The queen's hand brushed lightly against his, an almost imperceptible gesture that held more meaning than any ceremonial title. He looked at her long ears, their graceful arcs reflecting the soft light,